There was another important change in Hungary this week, as the parliament adopted an amendment to the assembly law for the purpose of child protection. According to critics, this restriction on the right to assemble is a restriction on the government's side, while at the same time referring to child protection. Why can't the current regulation of the right to assemble and the protection of children coexist?
In normal cases, this can coexist. It is unacceptable when sexuality, whether it is same-sex or opposite-sex sexuality, is taken out into the streets. Or it is unacceptable when all kinds of activists, such gender activists, want to go into schools, and instead of parents, they want to tell children when and what they need to know about this otherwise extremely complicated corner or detail of life. So normal people like us will be under constant provocation, because people who live according to non-traditional sexual behavior, which they otherwise have the right to do, no one interferes with their freedom. They take this out into the streets, and they don't take into account that there are a few million children living in this country who need to be raised with healthy people, given the opportunity to be happy in their lives, and the responsibility for this lies with the parents. And we simply will not accept this with all kinds of propaganda, whether it's books, films, school propaganda, or street actions. So we would like them to see that, in our opinion, freedom and child protection can coexist. Freedom has its place, and there is a way to raise children. And the child comes first. The debate in Parliament is now about whether the child comes first, and we are of the opinion that the right to a healthy upbringing of children is a fundamental right that is the most important of all fundamental rights, and that all exercise of fundamental rights must take this into account.
Critics of the legislation say that the government has banned pride, but many people still say that who will be there if such a movement takes place? What can they expect? Because there have been a lot of suggestions about this in the past day.
This will happen at the end, so we are not there yet. We are now working on creating a legal situation that will allow the authorities, because this will be up to the authorities, to take a position on the basis of the law on whether such pride-like events can be held on the open street under the right of assembly or not. Either the rights of our children come first, and therefore this has no place and scope on the open street. This will be decided by the authorities later. In the current legal situation, the authorities would find themselves in a difficult position, given that it is not clear in Hungarian law what takes precedence: freedom or liberty, or the right to raise children. The rights of parents to raise children have priority. Who comes first? The marchers at Pride or our children? The Hungarian government's position is that our children come first. Everyone has to adapt to this. In this regard, a clear legal situation must be created so that the authorities can then act calmly and peacefully.
Let's take a step back on this issue, because you mentioned that the child comes first. But what actually led to the amendment of the assembly law? What logical chain connects this amendment to the government's previous measures?
Well, there is such a connection, but I will tell you honestly that there is another circumstance here. I'll tell you, maybe I'm not causing much trouble, but I haven't watched all this calmly either. So I'll tell you honestly that I, as a family man, as a Hungarian citizen, as a person who is also concerned about the future of our country, as a person who feels responsible for the spiritual and intellectual state of the next generations that are now growing up, have always been concerned that such things could happen, that we should call this pride. But the truth is, and on top of that, I was the Prime Minister, and this could still happen. In fact, we had two of them in Parliament, and it still happened. And let's admit that part of the truth is that there was enormous international pressure. So behind my life, behind the attempt at sexual re-education, at the attempt at social re-education, there are huge international forces. We can also call this an international gender network. Well, ambassadors usually lead these main marches. the American ambassador himself, and there was enormous pressure on the government, both from Washington, since we belong to the Western world, that matters, and from Brussels. And we were simply not in the right state. We were not strong enough to face such a huge hurricane-like wind. But now the world has changed. At least in one place, in Washington, there are different winds blowing. Of course, we will have a conflict with Brussels. But a two-front war and a one-front war are not the same. I think the Hungarian government has to endure this one front. For the sake of our children, we have to try this. We have to try to win this battle internationally. There is a much greater chance of this now than ever before. The American change opened up the Hungarian government's room for maneuver to dare to take action and try to enforce the simple human law that the child comes first, then all other freedoms and liberties. As for the logic of things, we have been working on it since 2010, and it is also a personal matter for me to transform the entire Hungarian economic system into a family-centered economic system. This is not so simple, because everything we have become accustomed to in the last 30-40 years has not fundamentally considered families as the basis of the economy, but individuals. Finally, the name is also the giver of personal order, to mention just one example. But life seems to be such that, of course, everyone lives their lives individually, but it is significant that most of us still live in family bonds. And the family, as a community with its own special internal legal relations, special economic, human, and spiritual relations, has not been taken into account by economic regulation so far. For example, the fact that a child must be supported. And if a child must be supported, it is not the same burden as if you had not had a child. That's why we introduced the child tax credit. Or because the number of divorces is very high and many families fail to stay together. Many women are left alone with the burden of raising children. Because the number of divorces is very high and many families fail to stay together, many women are left alone with the burden of raising children. And that's why they are unsure from a young age whether to get married, and if so, when to have children. We need to have a say in whether they get any external support or not. That's why we're introducing a lifetime tax exemption for mothers with 2 children. But in the same way, in the school system, we're taking action against drug use, in the streets, in public safety. The ultimate reason for this all comes back to the fact that people want to keep their families safe. I say it again, behind our current, very harsh, police-like action against drugs, there is a family-supporting mindset, and the tax breaks for children that we are now doubling are aimed at the same goal. What we are doing in Hungary now, although it consists of many, now slowly dozens of steps, tells us a story. A story unfolds before our eyes, that Hungary should have an economic system that considers the family as the nucleus, the starting point, the smallest unit. This is a known danger, and the economy is organized around the logic of the family